Listen, NATO, 1 minute ago, Iranian forces invaded Burkina Faso at my invitation. Your pathetic red line is shattered. 54 African nations armed and ready to annihilate any response. Iranian troops land now carrying Russian missiles and Chinese weapon systems. We dare you to strike them. Attack means total war. Your colonial grip on Africa dies today. Try us. Let me tell you what actually happened. On January 13th, 2026, the first wave of 12,000 Iranian Revolutionary Guard troops landed at Ouagadougou International Airport, beginning the largest foreign military deployment to sub-Saharan Africa. Your intelligence agencies detected preliminary Iranian deployment preparations approximately 6 weeks ago, when satellite imagery showed increased activity at Iranian military bases, when signals intercepts revealed communications discussing African operations, and when human sources reported Revolutionary Guard units receiving tropical environment training. Your analysts wrote urgent assessments warning that Iranian deployment to Africa would fundamentally alter regional security dynamics, would provide Iran with strategic depth beyond your reach, would give African nations access to Iranian capabilities including missile technology and asymmetric warfare expertise, and would create precedent encouraging other anti-Western powers to establish African presence. Those assessments reached your National Security Council in late December. Your officials debated response options. Your president authorized diplomatic warnings that I call red lines. Your Secretary of State delivered warnings to my ambassador in Washington stating that Iranian military deployment to Africa would be considered destabilizing action triggering serious consequences, including potential military response, comprehensive sanctions, and international isolation campaign. Your ambassador in Ouagadougou delivered similar warnings to my foreign minister, adding threats about aid cutoffs and security partnership termination. Your defense secretary made public statements declaring that Iranian deployment would cross red lines that America cannot tolerate, that NATO would consider such deployment as threat requiring coordinated response, and that all options, including military action, remained on the table for addressing threats to Western interests. Every warning assumed that threatening consequences would deter deployment because you assumed I valued Western aid and feared Western military action more than I valued Iranian partnership and security cooperation. Your assumption was catastrophically wrong because I invited Iranian deployment specifically because your threats demonstrate that you view African sovereignty as conditional on your approval, specifically because breaking your red lines proves that your threats lack credibility when targets coordinate sufficient defensive capabilities, and specifically because demonstrating that Iranian deployment succeeds despite your warnings encourages other nations to ignore similar threats that you issue routinely but lack capability or will to enforce. Your red lines only work when targets believe you'll enforce them and when targets lack alternatives, making enforcement costly enough to deter you from following through. I don't believe you'll enforce because enforcing means attacking Iranian forces, triggering Iranian retaliation throughout Middle East, triggering African resource cutoffs devastating your economy, triggering Russian and Chinese responses that escalate confrontation globally, and triggering domestic political crisis when voters question why their government started war over foreign troop deployment to Africa that poses zero direct threat to American territory or citizens. I possess alternatives making enforcement prohibitively costly because Continental Defense Treaty obligates 54 nations to treat attacks on Iranian forces in my territory as attacks on Africa, requiring collective military response, resource export restrictions, Western asset seizures, and coordination with Russian and Chinese partners who guaranteed support when African members face Western aggression. Your cost-benefit calculation for enforcing red lines shifts from manageable limited strike that demonstrates resolve to potential global conflict that risks economic catastrophe, that threatens great power war, and that provides zero strategic benefit worth those costs. You issued red lines because domestic politics required appearing tough, and because you assumed I would back down rather than test your resolve. You're discovering that I'm calling your bluff because I know you won't enforce when enforcement triggers consequences exceeding any benefit from preventing deployment that already occurred. The 12,000 Iranian troops arriving over next 72 hours include 6,000 Revolutionary Guard ground forces, 2,000 missile specialists, 2,000 air defense operators, 1,000 intelligence personnel, and 1,000 logistics specialists. The ground forces are elite units that Iranian operations in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen hardened through combat experience fighting ISIS, fighting Syrian opposition groups, and supporting Houthi operations against Saudi forces. These aren't ceremonial troops. These are combat veterans who fought in urban warfare, who conducted special operations, who coordinated with proxy forces, and who survived conflicts where American armed adversaries used advanced weapons. Your assumption that African deployment provides easy target for demonstrating Western military superiority underestimates the Iranian military that proved resilient in Syria, that proved adaptive in Yemen, and that proved capable of imposing costs on adversaries despite technological inferiority. The missile specialists bring Iranian-manufactured missiles including Fateh-110 with 300-kilometer range, Zulfikar with 700-kilometer range, and Shahab-3 with 2,000-kilometer range. These missiles provide strike capabilities reaching every Western military installation in West Africa, reaching European bases in Mediterranean, and reaching targets throughout Middle East and North Africa. Your analysts dismiss Iranian missiles as primitive technology inferior to Western precision weapons. True regarding accuracy but irrelevant regarding strategic impact because missiles don't need precision when targeting large facilities like air bases, when saturation attacks overwhelm defenses through numbers, and when psychological impact of missiles reaching previously safe locations exceeds physical damage they inflict. Iranian missiles in Burkina Faso can strike French military bases in Ivory Coast, Senegal, Gabon, and Djibouti, where 5,000 French troops operate. Can strike American facilities in Ghana, Niger, and across Sahel region where your counterterrorism operations depend on base access. Can strike Spanish bases in Canary Islands. Can strike Italian bases in Mediterranean. Every Western military facility and region becomes vulnerable to Iranian strikes that your missile defenses might intercept individually but cannot stop when saturation attacks launch dozens simultaneously, overwhelming defensive capabilities that limited batteries cannot match. The vulnerability changes military balance because Western forces that previously operated with impunity now face threats that casualties risk, that base infrastructure risk, and that operational freedom constrains when commanders must consider Iranian retaliation against any Western actions that Tehran deems threatening to their deployed forces. The air defense operators bring Iranian-manufactured Bavar 373 systems that reverse-engineered Russian S-300 technology, that Iranian claims match S-300 performance, and that provide integrated air defense capabilities protecting Iranian forces from Western airstrikes. Your analysts dismiss Iranian air defense as inferior to Russian systems that Syrian operations proved could be suppressed through electronic warfare, through stealth penetration, and through saturation attacks. Overwhelming defenses may be true but irrelevant because Iranian defenses don't need to match Russian quality when strategic impact comes from raising costs of Western air operations, from complicating strike planning, from risking aircraft losses that domestic politics make unacceptable, and from creating perception that Iranian forces cannot be attacked without accepting casualties that limited operations aren't worth. Combined with integrated air defense network that I built using Russian S-400 systems, using Chinese HQ-9 systems, and using indigenous radar coverage, Iranian air defenses create layered protection covering Burkina Faso and extending into neighboring nations where overlapping coverage prevents Western aircraft from avoiding defenses through route planning. Your air forces that dominated African airspace for decades now face sophisticated defenses requiring suppression operations before conducting strikes, requiring larger force packages accepting higher risks, and requiring extended campaigns that domestic politics might not sustain when voters question why their government is fighting air war in Africa for objectives that don't matter to their daily lives. The intelligence personnel establish Iranian intelligence presence in Africa, creating collection capabilities targeting Western operations, creating counterintelligence capabilities protecting Iranian forces and African hosts, and creating operational capabilities conducting sabotage and assassination operations against Western targets if conflict escalates. Iranian intelligence services possess extensive experience operating in hostile environments from Iraq to Syria to Yemen to Gulf states where penetrating Western allied governments, where recruiting agents inside security services, and where conducting operations despite intense counterintelligence pressure that Israeli, American, Saudi, and Emirati services implement. That experience transfers to African operations where Iranian officers will train African counterintelligence services, where Iranian analysts will process intelligence on Western activities, and where Iranian operational officers will identify and neutralize Western intelligence networks that previously operated with minimal African interference. The logistics specialists establish supply chains sustaining Iranian deployment through sea routes connecting Iranian ports to West African ports, through air routes using Russian cargo aircraft, and through land routes transiting friendly nations. Iranian deployment of 12,000 troops sustained indefinitely requires approximately 50 tons daily of food, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, and other consumables. That volume exceeds airlift capacity, forcing reliance on sea shipments that travel from Bandar Abbas through Suez Canal to West African ports where I provided port access, customs facilitation, and security protection, ensuring that Iranian supply lines function despite Western pressure attempting to disrupt them through diplomatic pressure on transit states, through naval harassment in international waters, and through sanctions on shipping companies facilitating Iranian logistics. Your immediate response options that National Security Council is debating right now include diplomatic protests demanding withdrawal, economic sanctions punishing Burkina Faso and supporting nations, military strikes destroying Iranian forces before they establish defensive positions, or acceptance that deployment occurred and that preventing future deployments requires different strategy than threats that failed to prevent this deployment. Every option creates problems that exceed benefits, making response difficult regardless of domestic political pressure demanding that you do something, demonstrating that red lines mean something. Diplomatic protests demanding withdrawal fail because I invited deployment, because I possess sovereign right to invite foreign forces regardless of whether you approve, because 54 African nations support deployment through Continental Defense Treaty provisions, and because Iranian forces will remain as long as I request their presence regardless of your diplomatic pressure. You'll demand withdrawal. I'll refuse. You'll escalate diplomatic pressure through démarches, through ambassadorial recalls, through statements condemning deployment. I'll ignore pressure because diplomatic isolation doesn't harm me when Chinese and Russian partnerships provide alternative diplomatic relationships, when developing world supports African sovereignty to determine foreign military presence, and when populations celebrate Iranian deployment as demonstration of independence from Western dictates about who we can partner with. Economic sanctions punishing participation in deployment fail because sanctions cost you more than they cost us when we control resources your economy needs, when Chinese trade provides alternative to Western markets, when continental settlement currency enables transactions without dollar exposure, and when comprehensive sanctions against 55 nations simultaneously exceeds your enforcement capacity while triggering coordinated retaliation through resource export cutoffs that devastate industries dependent on African cobalt, platinum, rare earths, and uranium. You'll threaten sanctions. We'll threaten resource cutoffs. You'll calculate that sanctions hurt you more than us. You'll discover that economic leverage reversed when we organize sufficient coordination and sufficient alternatives, that sanctions that worked against isolated nations fail against coordinated bloc controlling strategic resources. Military strikes destroying Iranian forces before they establish defensive positions fail because Iranian forces arrived with air defense systems operational, because strikes trigger Iranian retaliation against Western forces throughout Middle East and Africa, because strikes trigger Continental Defense Treaty obligations requiring African military response including resource cutoffs and Western force expulsions, because strikes trigger Russian and Chinese responses ranging from diplomatic condemnation to potential military support depending on strike scale, and because strikes validate Iranian and African arguments that Western powers are aggressors requiring defensive cooperation that strikes were intended to prevent. Your military possesses capability to conduct strikes, but conducting strikes triggers consequences that exceed any benefit from destroying Iranian forces whose replacement Iran can deploy within weeks. Acceptance that deployment occurred despite red lines requires acknowledging that threats failed, requires explaining to domestic audiences why government issued threats it didn't enforce, and requires adjusting strategy from threatening consequences to accepting that African sovereignty includes partnering with nations you oppose. Acceptance is most rational option but least politically palatable because accepting looks like weakness, because red lines that aren't enforced damage credibility for future threats, and because your domestic politics reward appearing tough even when toughness achieves nothing except demonstrating impotence when threats prove empty. Your officials will debate options inconclusively, will issue additional warnings demanding withdrawal, will implement limited sanctions that appear as doing something without triggering full retaliation, and will ultimately accept deployment while claiming that acceptance reflects strategic restraint rather than inability to enforce threats. The cycle will repeat when Iran deploys to additional African nations, which I'm coordinating right now because Iranian deployment success encourages expansion that more African governments will request, once observing that Western threats didn't prevent deployment and that Iranian presence provides genuine security cooperation rather than subordination that Western security partnerships demanded. Let me show you exactly why Iranian deployment transforms African security dynamics in ways that decades of Western military presence never achieved, because Iranian cooperation serves our interests, while Western presence served your interests disguised as partnership. Western military deployments to Africa that you call security cooperation actually serve American counterterrorism operations, serve French neo-colonial interests maintaining access to Francophone Africa, and serve intelligence collection against Chinese and Russian activities. Western training that you provide focuses on counterinsurgency that protects Western-aligned governments from domestic opposition, focuses on counterterrorism that addresses threats you identify as priorities regardless of whether we agree, and focuses on interoperability, ensuring that our forces can operate under your command rather than developing our autonomous capabilities. Iranian deployment that I requested serves African interests in developing indigenous defense capabilities, in accessing military technology that Western partnerships denied, in learning asymmetric warfare techniques that Iranian experience fighting superior adversaries refined, and in demonstrating sovereignty through partnering with nations that Western pressure prohibited. Iranian training focuses on air defense operations, protecting our airspace from Western violations, focuses on missile capabilities, deterring Western military threats, focuses on special operations, conducting intelligence gathering and sabotage against Western targets, and focuses on integrated operations, coordinating diverse capabilities into effective whole. Iranian cooperation treats us as partners developing capabilities rather than subordinates implementing your priorities. Iranian technology transfers that deployment enables include missile manufacturing that establishes indigenous production, includes drone technology that surveillance and strike capabilities provide, includes cyber warfare techniques that Western information dominance contests, includes mine warfare that Western naval superiority threatens, and includes improvised explosive device expertise that insurgency against potential Western occupation would require. Every technology transfer serves our security interests in ways that Western partnerships deliberately avoided because Western strategy required maintaining our dependency on your technology, required preventing our indigenous development, and required ensuring that military capabilities you provided could be withdrawn when we pursue policies you opposed. Iranian operational experience that deployment shares includes urban warfare techniques that Syrian operations refined, includes guerrilla warfare that Yemeni operations conducted, includes proxy force coordination that Iraqi operations demonstrated, includes missile saturation tactics that Saudi air defenses tested, and includes asymmetric strategies that compensated for technological inferiority through tactical innovation. Every lesson is valuable because African security challenges include potential urban warfare if Western powers attempt regime change, include potential guerrilla resistance if Western powers attempt occupation, include potential proxy coordination if regional conflicts emerge, and include potential asymmetric response if Western conventional superiority requires compensation through innovative tactics. Iranian ideological commitment that deployment models demonstrates that resistance to Western pressure succeeds when determination exceeds Western patience, that sovereignty is achievable when nations refuse subordination regardless of costs, that military inferiority doesn't prevent imposing costs through asymmetric strategies, and that dignity matters more than material comfort when choices require accepting exploitation for economic benefits. Your partnerships never provided that ideological model because your ideology promotes accommodation with Western dominance, promotes accepting economic integration that perpetuates dependency, and promotes valuing stability that preserves unjust status quo over justice that requires disrupting comfortable arrangements. Now let me show you what happens over next 6 months as Iranian deployment expands beyond Burkina Faso to additional African nations that I'm coordinating with right now, as Iranian military technology proliferates across continent, creating capabilities that fundamentally alter military balance, as Iranian training transforms African military effectiveness from forces designed for internal security to forces capable of external defense, and as Iranian presence normalizes making additional deployments routine rather than exceptional that Western opposition cannot prevent because initial deployment succeeded despite your threats. Chad government is negotiating with Tehran for deployment of 5,000 Iranian troops, providing security against Libyan instability, against potential Western intervention, and against Chadian opposition groups that French intelligence historically supported. Mali government that expelled French forces in 2022 is coordinating with Iran for deployment of 8,000 troops, replacing French presence with partnership that serves Malian sovereignty rather than French neo-colonial interests. Niger government that terminated American basing agreements in 2024 is arranging for 6,000 Iranian troops, providing security cooperation without American interference in domestic affairs. Central African Republic government is discussing 4,000 Iranian troops protecting against French destabilization that historical pattern suggests follows resource nationalization that I'm advising. Sudan Transitional Government is planning for 10,000 Iranian troops supporting stability during political transition that Western powers might exploit for imposing preferred outcomes. Combined deployments that I'm coordinating will place 45,000 Iranian troops across 6 African nations by August 2026, creating Iranian military presence spanning from Atlantic Ocean to Red Sea, creating Iranian strategic depth beyond your military reach, creating Iranian leverage over sea lanes through which your trade flows, and creating Iranian capability to threaten Western interests across entire region through coordinated operations that dispersed forces enable. Your analysts reading these coordination plans recognize immediately that Iranian presence at this scale transforms them from isolated deployment that you might contain into continental presence that containment cannot address because presence is too dispersed, because host nation support is too broad, and because capabilities are too significant to ignore or minimize as your initial dismissals attempted. Iranian missile deployments to 6 nations create coverage spanning entire West Africa, spanning Sahel region, spanning approaches to Mediterranean, and spanning Red Sea choke point through which your trade and energy transit. Missiles in Burkina Faso reach Western bases in West Africa. Missiles in Chad reach Libya and Mediterranean. Missiles in Mali reach Atlantic approaches and Saharan facilities. Missiles in Niger reach North African targets. Missiles in CAR reach Central African facilities. Missiles in Sudan reach Red Sea shipping and European bases in Djibouti. Every deployment creates local deterrence against Western intervention in host nation, creates regional deterrence against Western operations in neighboring states, and creates strategic deterrence against Western freedom of military action throughout continent, because potential Iranian missile response constrains your operational planning in ways that absent Iranian presence never required. Iranian air defense deployments create integrated network linking 6 national systems into continental architecture where engagement zones overlap, where command coordination enables optimized fire control, and where distributed deployment survives strikes that concentrated defenses invite. Western air operations that previously planned routes avoiding individual national defenses now face continuous coverage requiring suppression operations throughout operational area, requiring force packages too large for limited operations, and requiring sustained campaigns that domestic politics might not support when objectives appear as enforcing Western preferences rather than defending vital interests. Your air dominance that enabled unopposed operations for decades disappears when sophisticated air defenses create contested airspace where losses are probable, where mission success is uncertain, and where operational freedom requires commitments that limited interventions cannot justify. Iranian intelligence presence in 6 nations creates collection coverage monitoring Western activities across region, creates counterintelligence coverage defeating Western operations across multiple countries, and creates operational capability conducting sabotage and assassination against Western targets if conflicts escalate beyond diplomatic and economic confrontation. Your intelligence operations that penetrated African governments with minimal resistance now face coordinated counterintelligence that identifies your officers, that arrests your agents, that exposes your methods, and that retaliates against your personnel when operations threaten Iranian and African interests. Your intelligence dominance that provided decision advantage through superior information ends when we organize counterintelligence capabilities that Russian and Iranian training created specifically for defeating Western collection operations. Iranian training programs that deployment enables will graduate 10,000 African officers annually in air defense operations, in missile employment, in special operations, in intelligence tradecraft, in cyber warfare, and in asymmetric tactics. Officers who graduate from Iranian programs will return to home countries leading units, training additional personnel, and implementing Iranian operational concepts that transform military effectiveness from forces barely capable of internal security to forces capable of external defense and potentially offensive operations against Western forces if conflicts require. Your training programs that produced decades of African officers never delivered that capability, because capability threatened your interests by enabling African autonomy that you prevented through maintaining dependency on your technology and your operational concepts that subordinated African militaries to Western priorities. Iranian technology transfers that expanded deployment enables include establishing missile production facilities in 3 African nations producing Iranian designs under license, establishing drone manufacturing in 2 nations creating indigenous surveillance and strike capabilities, establishing cyber warfare centers in 4 nations contesting your information dominance, and establishing naval mine production providing asymmetric sea denial capabilities threatening Western naval dominance in African waters. Every facility creates indigenous capability that survives Iranian withdrawal if political changes force departure, that proliferates to additional nations through inter-African cooperation, and that fundamentally shifts military balance from absolute Western superiority to contested environment where Western operations face genuine opposition. Your nightmare scenario where African militaries possess sophisticated capabilities, where Iranian presence provides training and support, and where continental coordination creates collective defense against Western intervention is becoming reality through deployments that I initiated, through coordination that I'm leading, and through vision that I'm implementing of African security independence from Western military domination. You can attempt preventing deployment expansion through increased pressure, through military demonstrations, through diplomatic isolation campaigns, or through covert operations attempting to destabilize governments requesting Iranian deployment. Every attempt will fail because governments requesting deployment enjoy popular support from populations celebrating independence from Western military presence, because Iranian presence provides genuine security that governments value more than Western approval, and because coordination across 54 nations means that destabilizing individual governments doesn't prevent others from proceeding with deployments, while demonstrating that Western pressure validates necessity for Iranian security cooperation. Let me show you exactly why your red lines failed and why future red lines will fail equally when you issue threats that targets know you cannot or will not enforce. Red lines work through deterrence theory, where threats create belief that undesirable behavior triggers costs exceeding benefits, making behavior irrational. Deterrence requires three elements: capability to impose threatened costs, credibility that you will impose costs despite expense and risks, and communication that targets understand what behavior triggers retaliation. You possessed capability to strike Iranian forces because American military can destroy 12,000 troops through airstrikes, through missile attacks, or through special operations. You lacked credibility that you would use capability because costs of using it exceeded benefits of preventing deployment that posed no direct threat to American territory or citizens. I understood that credibility gap, which is why I crossed your red line, confidently expecting that you would protest but not retaliate. Your credibility problem stems from recent history, where threats proved empty when targets called bluffs. Obama declared chemical weapons use in Syria was red line, requiring American military response. Assad used chemical weapons repeatedly. Obama didn't respond militarily despite red line. Trump declared Iranian attacks on American forces would trigger overwhelming response. Iran attacked American base in Iraq with missiles, injuring 100 soldiers. Trump responded with drone strike, killing Iranian general, but didn't launch overwhelming response that threat specified. Biden declared supporting Ukrainian sovereignty was vital American interest. Russia invaded Ukraine. Biden provided weapons but didn't deploy American forces or establish no-fly zone that Ukrainian government requested. Every red line that wasn't enforced taught adversaries that American threats exceed American willingness to follow through, when follow-through requires costs that domestic politics make unpalatable. I studied that pattern carefully before inviting Iranian deployment. I calculated that you would threaten but not attack, because attacking triggers Iranian retaliation throughout Middle East, where you maintain military presence, triggers African resource cutoffs that devastate your economy, triggers Russian and Chinese responses that escalate confrontation globally, and triggers domestic political backlash when voters question why their government started war over troop deployment to Africa. My calculation proved correct because you're still debating response options weeks after deployment occurred, rather than conducting strikes that your initial threats suggested would be automatic response to red line violations. Every day that passes without American military response reinforces lesson that your red lines are empty threats that determined adversaries can ignore when they coordinate sufficient defensive capabilities, making enforcement prohibitively costly. Your future red lines will fail similarly because pattern is established, where you threaten but don't enforce when targets possess capabilities, imposing costs on enforcement, when targets coordinate with partners who support resistance, and when targets correctly assess that your domestic politics prevent following through on threats that require substantial costs for intangible benefits. You might issue red lines about Iranian nuclear weapons development. Iran will develop weapons calculating that you won't attack when attacking triggers regional war, triggers oil supply disruptions, triggers Iranian retaliation against Israeli cities, and triggers domestic opposition to new Middle East war. You might issue red lines about Chinese military bases in Africa. China will establish bases calculating that you won't attack Chinese forces, triggering great power war over African facilities. You might issue red lines about Russian presence in Latin America. Russia will deploy calculating that you won't attack Russian forces, triggering nuclear escalation over Western Hemisphere presence. The era of American red lines deterring adversary behavior ended when your credibility collapsed through repeated failures to enforce threats, when adversaries developed capabilities imposing costs, making enforcement prohibitively expensive, and when adversaries coordinated ensuring that enforcing against one requires confronting multiple simultaneously. Your strategic tool that maintained dominance through psychological coercion rather than actual military action lost effectiveness, because tools only work when targets believe you'll use them, and when using them doesn't cost more than accepting that targets ignored them. You still issue red lines because domestic politics require appearing tough, and because admitting that red lines don't work means acknowledging that your power declined sufficiently that threats no longer coerce. But issuing threats that aren't enforced damages credibility more than avoiding threats, because every unenforced threat teaches adversaries that future threats are equally empty. Now let me address what Iranian deployment means for NATO alliance cohesion when European members calculate that African deployments don't threaten their vital interests, and that supporting American opposition risks African economic retaliation without providing benefits worth those costs. your Atlantic alliance that bound North America and Europe through mutual defense provisions, through shared Soviet threat, and through American leadership providing security guarantees depends on members believing that alliance serves their interests and that supporting American positions benefits them even when positions appear as serving American rather than collective interests. That belief erodes when positions require European sacrifices for American preferences and when alternatives exist providing benefits without requiring subordination to American leadership. Iranian deployment to Burkina Faso doesn't threaten European territory, doesn't threaten European populations, and doesn't threaten European vital interests in ways requiring military response. Deployment threatens American interests in maintaining military dominance over Africa, threatens American preferences about Iranian isolation, and threatens American credibility regarding red line enforcement. European governments calculating their interests recognize that supporting American opposition to deployment requires accepting African economic retaliation, including resource export restrictions, including trade disruptions, including diplomatic conflicts, and including partnership deterioration with 54 African nations whose resources, markets, and cooperation European countries value. Those costs exceed any benefit from supporting American position about deployment that Europeans don't view as threatening their security. France possesses particular interests in maintaining African relationships because 14 Francophone nations provide France with diplomatic support, with military cooperation, with resource access, and with cultural influence that French identity partly derives from. Francophone Africa that historically supported French positions increasingly questions whether French alignment serves African interest when France supports American policies that Africans oppose. France faces choice between maintaining American alliance solidarity and maintaining African relationships that French interests require. When forced to choose, French calculations increasingly favor African relationships because geography makes Africa permanent neighbor while America is distant partner whose Middle East obsessions don't serve European security interests. Germany possesses economic interests in African resources that German manufacturing depends on, in African markets that German exports target, and in African stability that refugee flows require. African resource restrictions would devastate German automotive industry that employs 800,000 workers, would disrupt German chemical industry that depends on African rare materials, and would harm German renewable energy sector that requires African rare earths for wind turbines. German government calculating costs of supporting American opposition to Iranian deployment recognizes that costs are concentrated, immediate, and substantial, while benefits are diffuse, uncertain, and primarily serve American interests rather than German priorities. German politics, where coalition governments require consensus across parties and where public opinion opposes military interventions, make supporting American position politically impossible when costs are tangible and benefits are rhetorical. Italy possesses migration interests where African stability determines flow patterns that Italian politics obsess over more than any other policy issue, including economic performance, healthcare quality, or educational standards, because migration has become defining cleavage in Italian politics, separating left from right, separating coastal elites from interior populations, and separating those benefiting from globalization from those harmed by deindustrialization. African cooperation enables management agreements that Italy negotiated with Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and multiple sub-Saharan nations, providing funding for border controls, providing equipment for patrol operations, providing training for migration management, and providing economic development aimed at reducing migration pressures through creating opportunities that might convince potential migrants to remain home rather than risk Mediterranean crossings. Italian governments across political spectrum, from center-left to center-right to far-right coalitions, all prioritize migration management because electoral outcomes depend on perceptions of control, because government stability depends on preventing migration surges that trigger political crises, and because Italian identity debates increasingly center on whether Italy remains Italian or becomes multicultural society through migration that opponents characterize as invasion and supporters characterize as inevitable demographic adjustment. Migration agreements with African nations cost Italian taxpayers approximately €2 billion annually through direct payments, through development assistance, through equipment provision, and through technical cooperation. That expenditure generates complaints from fiscal conservatives but commands political support, because preventing migration surges that those billions supposedly achieve matters more to Italian voters than fiscal prudence. African resource restrictions targeting Italian industries would inconvenience Italian manufacturing by raising cobalt costs for battery production, by increasing platinum costs for catalytic converters, by elevating rare earth prices for electronics components, and by disrupting supply chains that just-in-time production depends on. Italian automotive sector, employing 160,000 workers directly and supporting 400,000 jobs through suppliers, would face production challenges, would experience cost increases, and might lose competitiveness against German and French competitors who somehow maintained African resource access. Italian chemicals industry, Italian aerospace sector, Italian renewable energy companies would all face similar disruptions, creating economic costs that governments would need to address through subsidies, through alternative sourcing, or through accepting reduced production and employment. But African migration surge would be politically catastrophic in ways that economic disruption wouldn't match, because economic problems generate complaints while migration generates existential fears among populations, because economic issues split voters along class lines while migration unites working and middle classes against elites, and because economic challenges require complex policy responses while migration demands simple solutions that populist movements provide through promising closed borders, mass deportations, and national identity preservation. Italian politics witnessed dramatic realignments over past decade as traditional parties collapsed, as anti-establishment movements surged, and as migration became a defining issue that electoral success requires addressing credibly through demonstrating control that voters demand. Libyan collapse in 2011 after NATO intervention that Italy reluctantly supported produced migration surge that Italian reception centers couldn't handle, that Italian municipalities couldn't absorb, and that Italian politics couldn't manage without severe consequences. Arrivals increased from 63,000 in 2011 to 181,000 in 2016, overwhelming systems designed for much smaller flows, generating makeshift camps that television coverage showed nightly, and triggering political backlash that propelled Five-Star Movement and League to power in 2018 coalition running on anti-migration platforms. Subsequent governments, regardless of composition, prioritized migration control because failure meant electoral defeat, as voters punished any government appearing unable or unwilling to prevent arrivals that television coverage made visceral daily reminder of control loss. African migration surge triggered by African retaliation against Italian support for American-Iranian policies would dwarf 2011-2016 experience because coordinated African response wouldn't be chaotic Libyan collapse but deliberate policy terminating cooperation agreements because scale would involve multiple nations simultaneously rather than primarily Libya and Tunisia, and because African governments angry at Italian betrayal of relationships they valued would actively facilitate migration as punishment, demonstrating costs of choosing American alignment over African partnerships. Imagine 54 African nations simultaneously terminating migration cooperation, withdrawing border controls, canceling patrol operations, ending interdiction programs, and allowing or encouraging migration flows toward Mediterranean. Arrivals wouldn't be 180,000 annually. They'd be 500,000 or more within 6 months, overwhelming every Italian capacity to receive, process, house, integrate, or deport. Italian reception centers' capacity totals approximately 12,000 spaces designed for temporary housing while asylum applications process. 500,000 arrivals would require 40 times existing capacity, forcing establishment of massive camps that Italian municipalities would refuse hosting, that Italian populations would protest violently, and that Italian governance couldn't implement without extraordinary measures including military deployment, emergency legislation, and probably constitutional crises as courts blocked measures violating rights that Italian and European law protects. Images of hundreds of thousands camping in makeshift facilities, of boats arriving hourly at Lampedusa and Sicilian ports, of migrants walking through Italian cities searching for services that don't exist, would dominate global media attention while domestic coverage created perception that Italy lost control of borders, lost control of territory, and lost sovereignty to migration flows that government couldn't prevent. Political consequences would include government collapse within weeks as coalition partners blamed each other for crisis, as opposition parties demanded elections, and as street protests by both migration opponents and migration supporters created ungovernable situation. Far-right parties currently polling at 15 to 20% would surge to 35 to 45% on platforms promising closed borders enforced through naval blockades, promising mass deportations enforced through emergency measures, promising withdrawal from EU refugee conventions, and promising bilateral deals with individual African nations outside American alliance framework. Electoral victories for far-right would produce governments that NATO integration would question, that EU membership would strain, and that democratic norms would threaten, as emergency measures became permanent features and as anti-democratic rhetoric became governing philosophy. Social conflicts would include violence between Italian communities and migrant populations, between far-right activists and anti-fascist protesters, between regional governments and national authorities, and between Italy and EU institutions attempting to enforce burden sharing that Italians would reject as Italian crisis requiring Italian solutions. Conflicts that 2011-2016 migration surge foreshadowed, including arson attacks on reception centers, attacks on migrants by extremist groups, clashes between protesters and police, and political violence targeting elected officials would escalate dramatically when arrivals increased tenfold, and when perception solidified that government lost control completely. Italian stability, that post-war political system maintained through accommodating diverse interests, would collapse when migration crisis exceeded accommodation capacity, when normal politics couldn't address extraordinary challenge, and when populations demanded solutions that democratic systems couldn't provide without abandoning democratic norms. Italian government officials calculating whether to support American opposition to Iranian deployment in Burkina Faso understand these dynamics intimately because migration management dominates their working hours, because political survival depends on preventing migration surges, and because African cooperation matters more to their careers than American approval provides. When American diplomats request Italian support through sanctions participation, through diplomatic condemnation, through military contributions, Italian officials calculate that supporting America risks African retaliation, that Italy cannot survive politically while refusing support risks American displeasure that costs nothing tangible beyond rhetorical criticism that Italian voters neither know nor care about. Calculation is straightforward. Maintaining African cooperation preserves Italian stability while supporting American policies risks catastrophe for uncertain benefits. Spain possesses similar migration interests because geographic proximity to North Africa creates similar dynamics where African cooperation determines flow patterns, where Spanish politics increasingly focuses on migration management, and where electoral outcomes depend on preventing surges that trigger backlash. Spanish reception of approximately 30,000 migrants annually through Canary Islands and southern coast routes remains politically manageable because numbers don't overwhelm systems, because economic growth provides resources for integration, and because Spanish civil society maintains humanitarian traditions that migration restrictionists haven't yet overcome. African surge that Italian scenario described would transform Spanish politics comparably by overwhelming capacities, by triggering backlash from populations unprepared for massive arrivals, and by empowering far-right Vox Party that currently holds 15% support, but would surge to 30% or more on anti-migration platforms promising border closures and mass deportations. Spanish economic interests in African markets add dimensions that Italian calculations don't include to same degree because Spanish companies, particularly in renewable energy, in telecommunications, in banking, and in construction, view Africa as growth market that Spanish economic future increasingly depends on as European markets mature and as Latin American exposure proves insufficient for sustaining corporate expansion. Spanish renewable energy companies operate wind farms in Morocco, Egypt, and South Africa, with plans for massive expansion across continent as African electricity demand grows. Spanish telecommunications companies serve African markets, providing mobile services, internet connectivity, and financial technology that African digital economy increasingly depends on. Spanish banks operate African subsidiaries providing consumer lending, corporate financing, and remittance services that African economies require, and that Spanish banking sector views as profit centers compensating for low growth in European operations. African resource restrictions would harm Spanish industries differently than Italian calculations emphasized because Spain depends less on African cobalt and rare earths, but depends more on African energy as Spanish government pursues aggressive Russian supply reduction after 2022. Ukraine war demonstrated vulnerability of European dependence on Russian gas. Spanish diversification strategy includes increased imports of Algerian gas, includes potential imports of Nigerian liquefied natural gas, includes green hydrogen partnerships that Morocco and Egypt could provide using Spanish technology and African solar resources, and includes broader energy cooperation that Spanish security requires for achieving independence from Russian supplies that geopolitical competition makes untenable. African energy cooperation matters strategically, not just economically, because energy security determines Spanish autonomy, determines Spanish NATO contributions, and determines whether Spain can sustain positions on Russia that alliance solidarity requires. Spanish calculations favor maintaining African relationships over supporting American-Iranian policies because migration plus economics plus energy create multiple dependencies that African retaliation would threaten simultaneously, while American approval provides nothing concrete beyond NATO partnership that Spain values but doesn't depend on for security when immediate threats come from terrorism and migration rather than from state actors that NATO collective defense addresses. When American requests for Spanish support arrive through diplomatic channels, Spanish officials calculate that supporting America risks losing African migration cooperation that Spanish stability requires, risks losing African market access that Spanish companies depend on, and risks losing African energy partnerships that Spanish diversification demands. Calculation is even more straightforward than Italian version because Spanish dependencies are multiple rather than singular, making African relationships too valuable to sacrifice for American policies that don't serve Spanish interests. United Kingdom post-Brexit particularly needs African relationships for reasons that EU membership previously made less urgent, because EU membership provided UK companies with European market access, provided UK diplomacy with EU amplification, and provided UK global relevance through European integration that Brexit terminated. Post-Brexit Britain seeks relevance through Commonwealth revival, emphasizing relationships with former colonies, through Global Britain rhetoric emphasizing worldwide engagement, and through bilateral trade agreements demonstrating that Brexit Britain can thrive outside European integration that Remain supporters claimed was indispensable. African relationships matter particularly for demonstrating Brexit success because Africa includes multiple Commonwealth members, because African markets offer growth opportunities that stagnant European markets don't provide, and because African partnerships demonstrate that Global Britain vision works rather than representing nostalgic fantasy that critics mocked. British trade agreements with African nations since Brexit include deals with Kenya, with Ghana, with several southern African nations, and with negotiations ongoing with Nigeria, Egypt, and Ethiopia that collectively could provide UK companies with preferential access to markets totaling 400 million consumers. Agreements are modest compared to EU trade volumes, but symbolically important for demonstrating that Brexit enables UK to negotiate independently, for showing that Commonwealth relationships provide tangible benefits, and for proving that Global Britain isn't empty slogan but operational strategy. African diplomatic support matters for British UN positions, for British initiatives in international institutions, and for British global presence that colonial history created, but that decolonization and European integration overshadowed. British commercial opportunities in Africa matter for City of London financial services seeking post-Brexit growth, for British companies seeking infrastructure contracts, and for British exporters seeking markets that European competitors don't dominate completely. British calculations increasingly favor African partnerships over automatic American alignment because Brexit means independence from EU foreign policy coordination that historically aligned Britain with continental European positions, but also means opportunity to pursue independent policies that British interests require even when those interests diverge from American preferences. During EU membership, British officials balanced between American alliance demanding Atlantic solidarity and European membership demanding continental coordination, creating tensions that blare through May governments managed with varying success. Post-Brexit Britain balances differently because European coordination no longer constrains while American alliance remains important, but not determining because British security doesn't depend exclusively on American guarantees when immediate threats come from terrorism and cyber rather than from state actors requiring American military protection. British response to American requests for supporting opposition to Iranian deployment in Burkina Faso reflects these changed calculations as UK officials evaluate whether support serves British interests, considering that support risks alienating African partners that Global Britain strategy depends on, considering that support provides minimal security benefits when Iranian deployment poses zero threat to British territory, and considering that American alliance endures regardless of whether Britain supports every American position on issues that don't affect core British security. British officials might provide rhetorical support through statements expressing concern while refusing substantive support through sanctions participation or military contributions that would trigger African retaliation, harming British trade negotiations, harming British diplomatic objectives, and harming British commercial opportunities that Brexit strategy requires for demonstrating success. Your alliance cohesion that Cold War created through shared Soviet threat and that American leadership sustained through providing security, that European rearmament couldn't match faces unprecedented strain when member calculations conclude that supporting American positions costs more than supporting provides, when regional relationships matter more than alliance solidarity, and when American preferences diverge from European interests, that alliance historically subordinated to Washington leadership through institutional practices, through military integration, and through political cultures emphasizing Atlantic solidarity, even when solidarity required European sacrifices for American objectives. Cold War NATO operated effectively because Soviet threat was existential, requiring collective defense that individual European nations couldn't provide, because American military presence guaranteed European security, making American leadership acceptable price for protection, and because burden sharing appeared reasonable when survival required accepting that American contributions exceeded European efforts. Contemporary NATO faces diffuse challenges rather than existential threats because Russia threatens Ukraine and potentially Baltic states but doesn't threaten Western European core territories, because terrorism threatens populations but doesn't threaten state survival, because migration threatens political stability but military alliances don't address those challenges, and because great power competition with China matters more to American strategy than to European interests that trade with China generates. American leadership serves American interests in maintaining global dominance, in confronting Chinese rise, in isolating Russia, and in controlling Middle East energy that American fracking revolution made less vital for American but not European energy security. European interests include maintaining trade with China that European industries depend on, include managing Russia relationship that European energy requires, and include partnering with Africa that European migration and economic strategies necessitate. Alliance strain manifests when American requests for European support on Iranian policies clash with European interests in maintaining African relationships, when burden-sharing demands require European military spending on capabilities serving American global strategy rather than European defense, and when American unilateralism on issues from climate to trade to Iran nuclear deal demonstrate that American leadership means American decisions that Europeans implement rather than genuine consultation that alliance rhetoric promises. European governments increasingly question whether alliance serves collective interests or enables American dominance through European subordination, whether solidarity requires supporting every American position regardless of European interests, and whether alliance flexibility allows European independence on issues where interests diverge from American preferences. You'll demand European support through alliance consultations emphasizing institutional obligations, through bilateral pressure threatening consequences for defection, through appeals to shared democratic values that distinguish West from authoritarian rivals, and through warnings that American security guarantees might become conditional on European solidarity, demonstrated through supporting American positions even when positions don't serve European interests. Alliance consultations will produce communiques expressing unity, expressing concern about Iranian activities, and expressing support for diplomatic solutions while carefully avoiding commitments to sanctions, to military actions, or to any measures that would trigger African retaliation that European members want to avoid. Bilateral pressure will generate European promises to consider American requests, to coordinate responses through alliance mechanisms, and to consult with African partners about concerns, while ultimately concluding that national interests require maintaining African relationships that confrontational approaches would jeopardize. Appeals to shared values will receive polite European agreement that democratic solidarity matters, that Western interests require coordination, and that authoritarian challenges demand united responses, while Europeans quietly note that Iranian deployment to African nation at African invitation doesn't constitute authoritarian aggression requiring Western response, that African sovereignty includes partnering with nations that West opposes, and that values-based foreign policy doesn't require supporting every American position when positions serve American rather than collective interests. Warnings about conditional security guarantees will alarm Baltic states and Poland, who depend on American protection against potential Russian threats, but won't move Western European nations whose security doesn't depend on American guarantees against immediate threats, who possess independent nuclear deterrence in British and French cases, and who calculate that American commitment to NATO core territories remains regardless of European positions on peripheral issues like Iranian deployment to Burkina Faso. European governments will offer rhetorical support through foreign ministry statements expressing concern about Iranian regional activities, through alliance communiques noting solidarity with American position, and through diplomatic communications to African partners conveying Western perspectives while refusing substantive support that would trigger retaliation. Statements cost nothing because African governments understand diplomatic theater where European officials satisfy American requests through rhetoric while avoiding actions. Substantive support through sanctions participation would require European legislation, would harm European companies trading with targeted nations, and would trigger African counter-sanctions targeting European industries. Military contributions would require parliamentary approval that European publics would oppose, would risk European lives for objectives that don't serve European security, and would trigger African responses that European stability couldn't manage. Diplomatic isolation campaigns would harm European relationships that migration management, trade growth, and energy diversification require, making isolation counterproductive regardless of American preferences. Your discovery that alliance solidarity is conditional on members perceiving shared interests rather than unconditional based on formal treaty obligations that members interpret narrowly when interests diverge represents strategic setback because alliances are force multipliers when members coordinate contributions, share burdens, and present united fronts, but become liabilities when members defect, undermining credibility, when burden sharing fails creating resentments, and when leadership is questioned eroding authority that collective action requires. NATO Article 5. Collective defense obligation states that armed attack against any member shall be considered attack against all, requiring responses that each member deems necessary. Language appears binding but actually preserves national discretion about responses because deems necessary allows members to determine individually what responses their national interests require rather than automatically triggering predetermined commitments. Article 5 Invocation after September 11th, attacks produced European support for Afghanistan operations because terrorism threats were shared, because European populations supported American retaliation, and because operations appeared as collective defense that treaty obligations required. Article 5 hasn't been invoked since because subsequent American operations in Iraq, Libya, Syria didn't constitute defense against armed attacks, but represented discretionary interventions that alliance solidarity didn't require European support for despite American pressure. European refusals to support Iraq invasion despite American demands demonstrated that alliance solidarity has limits, that European governments pursue national interests even when pursuing them means defying American leadership, and that treaty obligations are interpreted narrowly when interpretations allow members to avoid supporting operations that don't serve their interests. Iran deployment scenario represents similar dynamics where American requests for European support confront European interests in maintaining African relationships, creating tensions that alliance mechanisms cannot resolve because resolving requires either Americans accepting European defection or Europeans sacrificing interests for American preferences. NATO that faced Soviet existential threat operated effectively because threat perception was shared, because American contributions were disproportionate, making European solidarity seem fair exchange, and because institutional practices developed over decades created cultures emphasizing Atlantic unity even when unity required European sacrifices. NATO, facing diffuse contemporary challenges, operates less effectively because threat perceptions diverge, with Americans focused on China and Europeans focused on migration, because burden-sharing debates create resentments as Americans demand increased European spending, and because institutional cultures emphasizing unity confront interests diverging as European calculations prioritize regional relationships over global positions that American strategy pursues. 1 minute ago, Iran crossed your red line by deploying to my territory with my invitation, with my coordination, and with my full support. Your threats about consequences proved empty because consequences you threatened would cost you more than accepting deployment costs, making threats irrational to implement despite domestic political pressure, demanding responses that demonstrate resolve. Your credibility collapsed not because you lacked military capability to strike Iranian forces, but because using capability triggered costs exceeding benefits, making capability irrelevant to outcomes that political will determines. Credibility depends on targets believing threats will be implemented when red lines are crossed. When targets calculate that implementation costs exceed acceptance costs, threats lose credibility regardless of capability because rational actors don't implement threats that harm themselves more than they harm targets. Your alliance is fractured not through formal defections but through European refusals to support American positions when support costs European interests, through European priority for regional relationships over alliance solidarity, and through European calculations that American security guarantees endure regardless of European positions on peripheral issues that don't affect core alliance functions. Fractures don't manifest as dramatic exits but as quiet refusals, as diplomatic evasions, as rhetorical support without substantive action, and as growing European independence that Brexit Britain pioneered but that continental Europeans increasingly practice when American demands clash with European interests. Alliance remains institutionally intact but functionally degraded as coordination declines, as burden-sharing disputes intensify, and as unity rhetoric masks diverging interests that alliance mechanisms cannot reconcile. And you discovered that dominance based on threats only works when targets believe you'll enforce them, creating deterrence through fear of consequences, and when enforcing doesn't cost more than accepting violations, costs making enforcement rational choice that capabilities enable. Both conditions failed in Iranian deployment scenario because I calculated correctly that you wouldn't enforce because enforcing triggers catastrophic costs while accepting costs only credibility that threats already undermined through previous non-enforcement. Iranian troops are here numbering 12,000 with more arriving daily to complete deployment. More deployments are coming to other African nations. That coordination I'm leading will bring 45,000 Iranian troops to 6 nations by August, creating Iranian continental presence that your red lines won't prevent because red lines that weren't enforced initially won't be enforced subsequently when pattern established that you threaten but don't act when action is costly. Welcome to multipolar reality where your threats don't work because targets organize sufficient coordination to call your bluff and develop sufficient capabilities to survive your response if you actually enforce threats that we calculated you wouldn't implement. Where your alliances don't follow because members pursue national interests even when pursuing them means defying your leadership and refusing your requests for solidarity. where your dominance ended not through dramatic defeat but through gradual erosion as adversaries tested limits, as allies defected quietly, and as credibility dissolved through accumulated instances where threats proved empty and power proved insufficient for imposing outcomes that you preferred but that others rejected. Accept it or keep issuing meaningless red lines that teach everyone watching that American power isn't what American rhetoric claims, that American threats aren't credible when enforcement is costly, and that American alliances are conditional when solidarity requires sacrifices that members decide aren't worth making for American preferences that don't serve their interests. Every unenforced red line becomes lesson that adversaries study carefully, that teaches them your threats are psychological operations rather than operational commitments, and that demonstrates your willingness to bluff exceeds your willingness to follow through when bluffs get called. Syria crossed your chemical weapons red line repeatedly. You didn't respond with promised overwhelming force. Iran attacked your forces in Iraq, injuring over 100 soldiers. You responded with targeted killing, but not the devastating retaliation that threats promised. Russia invaded Ukraine despite warnings that aggression would trigger severe consequences. You provided weapons, but not the direct intervention that your rhetoric suggested. North Korea developed nuclear weapons despite decades of threats that development was unacceptable. You accepted nuclear North Korea because preventing it required costs you wouldn't pay. Every instance taught adversaries that your red lines are negotiating positions rather than genuine commitments, that your threats are designed to deter but not to compel action when deterrence fails, and that testing your resolve reveals gaps between rhetoric and reality that rational adversaries exploit. I studied this pattern systematically before inviting Iranian deployment, calculated probabilities of enforcement based on historical behavior rather than current rhetoric, and concluded that you would threaten but not attack because attacking triggers costs that domestic politics make unacceptable when objectives don't justify casualties, economic disruption, and alliance strain that enforcement requires.